Hello, everybody. On behalf of the Crown Center for Middle East Studies at Brandeis University, I want to welcome you to a special Crown seminar on elites, institutions, and ethnic state capture in pre- and post-2003 Iraq. My name, by the way, is Eva Bellin. I am a professor in the politics department at Brandeis and a member of the Crown Center. And we are very lucky to have two leading political scientists in the Boston area who will walk us through this very thorny topic. We're going to begin today with a 10-minute presentation on this topic by my colleague, Shamiran Mako. Professor Mako teaches at the Pardee School of Global Studies at Boston University. She also has a joint appointment at Boston University's Department of Political Science. Professor Mako's research focuses on international relations and comparative politics of the Middle East, with a special focus on ethnic politics, post-conflict state building, and governance in divided societies. And she is the author of After the Arab Uprisings, Progress and Stagnation in the Middle East and North Africa. And she is also the co-editor of State and Society in Iraq, Citizenship under Occupation, Dictatorship, and Democratization. But today, she is going to draw on her latest book project, focusing on structured inclusion, the institutional legacies of ethnic conflict in Iraq. And in that book, she is exploring the relationship between ethnic conflict and post-conflict state building in Iraq. After Professor Mako has presented her findings, we will turn the mic over to my colleague, Melani Cammett. Professor Cammett is the Clarence Dillon Professor of International Affairs in the Department of Government at Harvard University. She also serves as the director of the Weatherhead Center for International Affairs at Harvard. She is the author of several books, and editor as well, including Globalization and Business Politics in North Africa, Compassionate Communalism, Welfare and Sectarianism in Lebanon, and The Politics of Non-State Social Welfare in the Global South. She is currently conducting research on toleration and reconciliation after ethno-religious violence, focusing on Lebanon and Bosnia and other troubled areas in the world. Now, Professor Cammett will conduct a 30-minute discussion with Professor Mako about her work. Then at 11:45, Professor Cammett will lead us through a 30-minute Q&A session based on the questions that you, the audience, will submit via the Q&A tab on your screen. And then we will wrap up promptly at 12:15. Now, before we begin, I just want to give you a quick reminder that this seminar is being recorded and it will be posted after the event on the Crown Center's YouTube channel, as well as on the events tab in the Crown Center's website. Again, if you have questions, please pose them to our esteemed guests. At any point during the presentation, just click on your Q&A section and we will be monitoring that so that we can raise those for discussion towards the end. So with that said, let's begin with the presentation by Professor Mako.
Thank you so much, Eva. Thank you so much, Melanie, for chairing this conversation. I'm really thrilled to be here with you this morning. And I also really want to thank Karen, Ramiar, and Nagme at the Crown Center for the invitation. I'm really delighted to be here. I'll go through this presentation really quickly, which kind of captures both the article that was recently published over the summer, and it gives the kind of broad outline of the book project, more specifically, which I think, thankfully, Melanie has read a chapter of in great detail. And so really quickly, the book project emerged out of this puzzle, and the puzzle came out of some of the interviews and archival research that I was doing over the past few years with dissident and opposition groups who had played, I think, an outsized role in the Iraq War, both in terms of Iraq War planning before 2003, and those same groups really came to shape the type of institutions that were put in place after 2003, both at the Interim Governing Council and then subsequently after 2005 when the Constitution was adopted. And so the question began with, how did you mobilize? How did you coalesce? What were some of the interests interests that shaped both the mobilization and, coordination strategies amongst really different opposition groups and elites throughout the 1980s, 1990s. And I came across this, was shared with me by a member of the opposition movement of the 1990s, Mithaq or Charter 91, based on the charter that was drafted by different opposition groups. And the charter goes into detail about who these opposition groups are. And it basically was presented in Salahuddin in Iraq and after the 1992 opposition, one of the earliest opposition group meetings that takes place in the northern semi-autonomous Kurdistan region. And in the charter, it's kind of like a blueprint for what these otherwise very desperate ethnic elites and the opposition groups, political groups that they were tied to, thought about and envisioned the state would become should the Ba'ath government, collapse. And this was obviously at the time when Iraq was quite vulnerable. It comes out of the 1990 invasion of Kuwait and then the subsequent multilateral coalition that goes into the country and then during the sanctions era. But this charter kind of gives a really interesting and very rich account of the visions that these otherwise, again, very different ethnic opposition groups had for how they would come to govern Iraq if there was regime change. Now, why do studying these opposition groups matter? They matter because they informed American policy. They were quite active in London and in Washington, D.C. These were the two main kind of sites of opposition group organization. The Kurds had very strong presence in, for example, in London and shaping opposition policy towards dissident groups and towards Iraq with the UK government. And Shia groups were quite prominent, and some Kurdish groups as well, in Washington, D.C. Throughout the 1990s, through different congressional hearings, these groups, influenced how policymakers who were operating in Turkey and Jordan and Lebanon kind of came to view the question of regime change and regime stability and the role of these opposition dissident groups would have should there be regime change. And this is just one example from 1999, so really at the cusp of thinking more. This is just a year after the passing of the Iraq Liberation Act, which was heavily influenced by dissident opposition groups operating, in the U.S. And there's this kind of collective thinking in the late 1990s that really that regime change was a necessary precondition for any effective action against Saddam Hussein's regime. Now, some of the works that have been published on this time period, though that scholarship is changing, there's this kind of thinking that these groups were influential, but they really weren't that influential. And what I argue in the book, especially in the last chapter of the book, is they were quite influential, not in terms of just the question of agency, but in actually thinking about the operationalization, but also mobilization tactics of these groups across a very kind of long time period. And I focus in on, well, how did these groups come together and why were their interactions so limited, right? It's really one of the few instances where we see ethnic groups quite different in terms of their visions, their platforms, their ethnic base, coming together kind of under one united goal, but then fragmenting, when there's an opportunity structure to kind of influence an emergent state. Now, American, policymakers, this is at the State Department and at the DoD, were quite ambivalent about the actual agency, but also legitimacy that these groups had inside the country. This is from a kind of simulation that was held at the DoD it's now declassified from the DoD, that was held in 1999 and thinking about, and it was basically, they brought in different experts, opposition group members, and they thought about what type of regime change would happen and who would kind of take after governance should the regime collapse. And if there was kind of this foreign intervention that American policymakers at the time had been thinking about, but not really fully kind of articulated. And it's clear that, in this section to the left, the right of your screen, Iraqi opposition weakness was a significant factor. So while they talked about how these ethnic groups came together, there's a lot of kind of, questioning and ambivalence about the actual legitimacy that these groups would hold on the ground should there be regime change and if they were brought to power. And so with that, how do we kind of, both the article and the broader book project looks at this kind of larger thinking about how we think about state building, power sharing, and elite bargaining. Now, there's great literature on all of these kind of three sets of literatures, and the literature is immensely vast in terms of how we think about the interaction really of these three factors. There's great work, for example, that's been done on interethnic mobilization and cooperation in divided societies. Manuel Vogel's recent book looks at the kind of how colonial policies influence both the type of institutions that emerge and how their legacies kind of carry forward. Others have looked at this question of repression and exclusion and how that kind of preconditions political settlements and elite choices at the onset of, post-conflict state building. There's a ton and very rich literature, which Melani and others have contributed to, the question of elite consensus and power sharing institutions more broadly. And so my book project kind of contributes to this broad set of literatures to ask, one, under what conditions do otherwise very desperate political elites cooperate to form interethnic resistance coalitions in divided authoritarian polities? And how do legacies of exclusion and repression shape ethnic elite bargaining and consensus building in deeply divided societies? Now, the literature looks at these questions, but almost they're siloed, right? That these interactions happen, but they have the question of legacies and looking at the longue durée of how colonial policies kind of come to shape both elite interactions, but also institutions, is kind of an emerging field, I think, in many ways when we look at both Iraq, but also other comparative case studies. So why Iraq? What does Iraq tell us? This is this kind of shows the distribution of ethnic power relations in the country. This is taken from the ethnic power relations data set. And what's interesting about Iraq is that these kind of group size and power relations really haven't changed across time in a lot of ways, which gives us kind of rich empirical variation that we can capture across different regime types, right? In terms of, Shia Arabs, they're kind of, as a dominant majority, their kind of rule ebbs and flows. And then, of course, in 2003, we see this kind of heightened control of the state, whereas Sunni Arabs and Kurds, for example, almost kind of border in terms of their power relations with each other, but also in comparison to Shia Arabs. And when we look at Turkmen and Yazidis and Assyrians, these kind of smaller minorities, again, their power relations really don't change much across time. And so why do I focus on dissident, how institutions influence and affect both the types of dissident opposition groups that emerge inside of Iraq, but also their mobilization outside the country, both in regional states and outside the region as a whole? Iraq has a rich history of ethnic political parties that at times were excluded from the state. Most of the time, these political parties were excluded from the state. But also, a lot of these ethnic political parties really formed the core of the opposition movements that emerged in that earlier slide that I showed that drafted the Charter Action 91, right? And so these parties, with the exception of the Iraqi Communist Party, though even in the opposition groups, there was some tacit representation of the Iraqi Communist Party, but not much because the party had been purged so badly by the Ba'ath regime in the 1970s. And so these members of these political parties and the elites that kind of founded them and played an instrumental role in the opposition movement continue then to have a pretty sizable effect on both determining the type of institutions that emerged after 2003 and the ways in which the political system was negotiated, both formally and informally, which is something I'm hoping to be able to get to in the Q&A. And so how did these groups, what were some of the grievances that these groups articulated? First and foremost, one of the common kind of issues that came up in conversations with interviews with Iraqi opposition groups, but also looking at their newspapers and magazines, was the question of capturing the state. There's a collective thinking, a kind of common denominator amongst them all, that Sunni Arabs had come to dominate the state since the time of colonial state formation. And that really had an effect on both how they came to govern the state, but also the ways in which they shaped repression and exclusion against majority groups and minority groups that they saw as a threat to their rule. And this is a graph that just gives you a distribution of Sunni Arabs across time and their dominance in the early Iraqi cabinets under colonial state formation and the monarchy, which I argue in the book serves as the kind of key foundation for how then subsequent elites came to govern and dominate the state. This really doesn't change. This is a data set I've created that looks at the distribution of executive institutions by ethnicity across time. You see this kind of clear Sunni dominance that then kind of changes with the Qasim coup in 1958 that topples the monarchy. And it kind of carries through. I mean, the cabinet posts actually shrink, the executive institutions shrink, but Sunni Arab dominance continues. And then post-2003, there's this kind of rupture that happens where the ethnic dominance is kind of reversed. And so the question I ask in the book is, what institutions shape how these elites kind of negotiated the space throughout these time periods? And just really quickly to kind of sum up, because I'd love to open it up to Q&A and engage with Melani. My outcomes of interest and contribution is one, I look at the historical developments. I look at how historical developments and legacies shape constraints and opportunities for inter-ethnic mobilization in authoritarian polity. So on the one hand, the literature tells us that in a lot of divided societies, ethnic groups kind of tend to pull apart. And these interests become so cemented that institutions, power-sharing consociational institutions, either work or they don't work. And so this is the kind of centripetal versus centrifugal debate within the kind of broader debate on power sharing. I argue that there are opportunities. There are times when inter-ethnic mobilization happens in divided societies, and that creates a space that kind of would otherwise be closed in comparison with other states, especially post-Civil War kind of settings. Two, elite bargaining is really preconditioned by historically contingent structural and institutional constraints in post-colonial divided societies. In other words, what happens at the outset since the time of colonial state formation has this kind of legacy that carries forward. That legacy ebbs and flows, but it carries forward in terms of how excluded groups both shape their strategies, but also come to see the state as something that needs to be captured and governance needs to be kind of corrected, rather than kind of emphasizing a consensual state building process. And that pre-2003 ethnic mobilization in Iraq really serves as an antecedent condition. So this is something I bring about in the historical institutionalist analysis of my book, and broader argument is that these antecedent conditions not only tell us how these groups came together, but why and at what junctures. And there's quite a bit of variation and fragmentation within these groups, but all of them have this kind of common goal, but that common goal really fragments when there's an opportunity to govern inclusively, which is something I'll go into in the Q&A. And fourth, that excluded group grievances prior to 2003 made post-2003 state building susceptible to what I call ethnic elite state capture, right? So groups were much more concerned and saw post-2003 as a corrective turn rather than a consensual kind of reform turn and process in Iraq's political development. And I argue that this is actually the bedrock of what's made power sharing institutions really fragile and kind of have actually failed in some way. And that muhassasa or ethnic power sharing preceded post-2003. This becomes very clear in the conversations with Iraqi opposition movement members, but also in some of their writings. They really were kind of digging into the question of ethnic quotas, debating how many seats should the KDP get, how many seats should, Dawa get, etc. And so this notion that muhassasa ta'ifiyya is something that emerges and is institutionalized after 2003, I kind of really nuance that and argue that it's actually, something that was debated heavily by opposition and dissident groups before regime change in 2003. And so I'll leave it at that, and I'm happy to both hear Melani's comments and the Q&A from the audience. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you so much. This is really fascinating work and a major contribution. We have so much to learn about the nitty-gritty of what actually went on in Iraq in, the decades preceding 2003, and then how that evolved in that important critical juncture of 2003. And you are really showing us what's going on, at the same time speaking to very important social science debates about institutional origins and change, and about the dynamics of power sharing. So it's been a pleasure to read some of your articles, and then to read the advanced copy of the introductory book chapter. I'm looking forward to seeing the full book. And on those bases, I wanted to ask you some questions about your work, starting with this interesting tension you raise between the unifying effects of repression on opposition organizations, and yet what you refer to as the stickiness of ethnic fragmentation. So I want to understand that more, because we have a number of people, most recently or perhaps very prominently, Elizabeth Nugent, making the argument that the experience of repression under authoritarian rule is a unifying factor for otherwise ideologically distinct elements of opposition groups. And so we see echoes of that kind of argument in your work. At the same time, it seems to fall apart at a certain point. And so I wonder if you could take us through those processes in a bit of detail. What is it that violence does, the experience of violence, to unify, and why is it not so effective in maintaining unity? What are the dynamics of ethnic fragmentation? Why does ethnicity, which social scientists have come to argue is a constructed category, why is ethnicity so sticky here?
Yeah, thank you so much. I've kind of dug very deeply into Liz's book when it came out, and I think it's one of the most kind of robust and fascinating works that's come out on this question. I think the key difference really in terms of how I distinguish the question of repression and exclusion in Iraq versus places like Tunisia is that ultimately really Tunisia, where you have political fragmentation shapes both kind of repression and mobilization in Tunisia, but in terms of, it's not a divided society, whereas Iraq is a divided society, which means that different ethnic groups had, one, very different experiences with the state, and two, the kind of beyond ethnic divisions, there's also subnational fractionalization, right, and kind of territorial divisions. The Kurds in the north, since the time of colonial state formation, have kind of had this very antagonistic vision towards the centralization of rule in Iraq, centered in around Baghdad. And those divisions were both material, right? There's a kind of strategic element to it, but there's also, a question of kind of thinking about homeland politics, right? And the lost opportunity for establishing Kurdish state. I think the key distinction is that in Tunisia, you have a fairly homogenous society where forms of mobilization and kind of elite fragmentation and questions of repression that fall along political lines. In the case of Iraq, as a very kind of heterogeneously different society, these divisions kind of permeate both along communal fault lines, but also along territorial and ideological fault lines, which is, I think, something that's a bit distinct from what happens in Tunisia. But nevertheless, the question of, how repression shapes these interactions is really crucial. And I, build on Liz's book in looking at how ethnic divisions and kind of distinct group interests undermine shared experiences, in as much as post-2003 state building became about survival rather than the kind of collective cohesive effort to power sharing institutions. And interestingly, one of the things that comes up in interviews with elite opposition members is that they really had no vision for post-2003 in a sense. They thought about regime change, but didn't think about the day after regime change in that sense. And they're very forthcoming about this. And they, that kind of strategic calculation that shapes ethnic elite interactions was really much more centered on correcting past grievances through capturing the state and reinserting new forms of dominance, rather than kind of creating and maintaining cohesive power sharing institutions. And this really comes out in these interactions through kind of newspapers, magazines of opposition groups, where they're debating these things, but they're not really thinking about, you know, what power sharing actually means and how that might ultimately mean that Kurds have to cede some of their power, Shias have to cede some of their power, whereas they saw it as, now we get a hold on power. And I think that's a kind of a different calculation that we see playing out that really undermines otherwise this kind of convergence that we see between very different ethnic groups and mobilizing around a common kind of collective good. But that kind of splintering when there's an opportunity to come to power. And I argue in the book that's predicated on a survival strategy, right? It's much more about survival and political state capture than it is about maintaining power sharing institutions.
Great. Actually, while we're on the topic of power sharing, I wanted to jump to the history of power sharing of Muhassasa Ta'ifiyya in Iraq. And in your 2023 article, I believe in International Peacekeeping, one of your interviewees points to the US government's mistake of adopting Muhassasa. But your arguments and your historical process tracing show that this principle and the principle of ethnic power sharing more generally predates American involvement by a long shot. So I'm curious to hear if, first of all, if you could take us through a brief history of where the principle came from and how it originated, but more analytically, what is the relative weight of American policy choices versus other factors in shaping ethnic politics, ethnic power sharing in Iraq after 2003?
Yeah, that's such a great question. The opposition is both united, but they're also fragmented in terms of how they see this question of power sharing. So some opposition members that I interviewed, which I kind of cite in the article, people like Hoshyar Zebari, when I had a conversation with him last year in Erbil, or just outside of Erbil, said, we look to power sharing because historically, Kurds were in the cabinet. Then the person that he refers to was in the monarchical cabinet, but his rule only lasted like 3 weeks. And what these types of interactions really were ways of generating solidarity and were actually quite strategic in being able to kind of create a common denominator for how all of these groups could coalesce. And so there was kind of elite divisions over how they saw this and these questions of, power sharing. The role of the Americans was not uniform across all of the opposition groups. Some people thought that the Americans really kind of gave the institutional impetus and the political impetus for institutionalizing power sharing to a detriment. And others kind of nuanced it a little bit more. So they said, yes, we wanted power sharing, but that these kind of ethnic-based allocations that the Americans really emphasized in the interim governing council became the main kind of playbook for how different, opposition groups that came to power after 2003 kind of came to institutionalize these informally. And so while they agreed that the best way to govern post-2003 Iraq, power sharing was the best kind of tool and consultation was the best tool to kind of give them this ability, to give them a stake in the game. They didn't necessarily agree that that was the best system. And some of them, and in the opposition newspapers, for example, they talk about this tension. Some of them kind of are very vocal about, we also don't want a state that is just strictly based on Ta'ifiyya. And where the different kind of groups have a stake in power. But others ultimately, especially the major coalition and dominant blocs amongst the Kurds and amongst the Shias, kind of saw this convergence of consultational power sharing as the best option to come to rule Iraq after 2003. And here and elsewhere, both in the article and elsewhere, I've talked about a lot of things that were left to be determined, like really important negotiations when we think of political settlements in the case of Iraq, were left to be, determined at a later date. Things like, how elections were to play out, things like revenue allocation, and actual kind of quotas and power sharing at the district, the kind of local level, none of these things were really kind of thought about. And much of that harks to thinking about the American role, is that there's a very expedient state building process. And many people have talked about this. Toby Dodge, among others, have talked about the kind of how we think about the incoherence of the state. But that in and of itself was also kind of very intimately linked to how opposition groups that came to power negotiated with different social forces in the country. On the one hand, opposition, groups, local forces in the country saw opposition groups as kind of, these exiled elites that were coming from abroad, had very little legitimacy. And at the same time, these groups had to negotiate with key stakeholders about the role of Americans in the country, for example. And so this kind of expedient state building process left a lot of these things to be determined. And one of the kind of key questions is, and I think this is what distinguishes Iraq from, places like Lebanon or Burundi, proportional representation is not codified in a constitution. This is what Bogarts is called this kind of informal consociational model. And in some ways that served opposition interests, right? It tamed these divisions in the opposition movement that were saying, yeah, sure, we need power sharing, but we shouldn't codify it, because codifying it would effectively mean that we're creating an ethnocracy, or a state that's led by ethnic groups. And that kind of went in contradiction with some of the political platforms of opposition groups. But the informal element was actually strategic choice. It gave them the best of both worlds, right? It allowed them to use ethnic quotas, but that wasn't enshrined in the Constitution. And I think if we think about it, it's not, that process in itself was actually not incoherent, it's strategic. And so I think much of this kind of influenced what was codified after 2003 and what wasn't. And so I think all of these kind of shaped how we think about muhassasa and its emergence.
That's fascinating. And actually, this raises a question for me about non-sectarian or non-ethnic mobilization within Iraq, which has been on the rise, particularly since the 2019 round of protests and mobilization. And I wonder if you could tell us more about the state of anti-sectarian, anti-ethnic mobilization in Iraq. Who are the main protagonists? I know that sometimes the Sadrists have tried to position themselves in this space. And so what is the fate of these movements and perhaps their political instantiations in Iraqi politics? And is the informal nature of power sharing in Iraq a factor that facilitates the rise of these kinds of movements, or is it not really relevant?
Well, I think it's so interesting. If we look at the Tishreen protests in 2019, overwhelmingly the people who participated in Tishreen were people from the southern provinces. A lot of kind of disenfranchised youth, disenchanted youth who grew up, post-2003. Iraq is a very young population. I think something like 60% of the population is what we would consider youth population in development terms. These were the people who were quite active on the street. And what that did was at the end of the day, they were quite concentrated in around the southern provinces. The Kurds in the north tried to protest, but that, there's a very kind of heavy securitized ways in which the Kurdistan regional government deals with protests in general. And I think that's a bit of a separate question from how we think about the Tishreen protests. But ultimately, what we've seen is a movement that comes up, a movement that espouses to be anti-sectarian, a movement that's predominantly, Shia-led, and it speaks to a couple of dimensions. One, the growing nature of intra-ethnic fragmentation that we've seen the power sharing and informal consociational system has produced over time. And so you have this kind of fragmentation that emerges 20 years later that is, the dominant and established opposition parties have this kind of informally institutionalized system that ultimately gives them a stake in the game. And it works in how across different electoral cycles, these ethnic parties ultimately kind of negotiate who gets what. So who gets allocated which ministry, who gets to dominate which ministry, and kind of in thinking about who comes to power, that works on behalf of these dominant ethnic groups. It works to kind of tame these otherwise very kind of segmented political parties. But what we're seeing, I think one of the outcomes of the Tishri movement, and we're seeing this actually in the Kurdistan region, but on a different level, and I think on a different scale, is intra-ethnic divisions and fragmentation. There's some really interesting work that's been done by Zahra Ali, Marcin al-Shamri, amongst others, that kind of speaks to this question of how deep-seated corruption, kind of endemic corruption, has had worse outcomes for people who otherwise come from areas that are represented by their own dominant ethnic groups. So if we think about, for example, Basra, right, the most oil-rich province in all of Iraq, which should, kind of if we think about broad development terms, should have the best kind of development outcomes, and it doesn't. It's actually one of the worst provinces in terms of environmental degradation, development, etc. And so a lot of this mobilization is actually happening in some ways in siloed kind of spaces where mass mobilization is happening against kind of established political parties, but on an intra kind of ethnic level. The same with the Kurdistan regional government. You know, for those of us who follow Iraq, we're seeing so many kind of small scale, very controlled, and kind of very dispersed protests when they emerge against this kind of failure of governance between the KDP and the PUK that stifled both economic development and social development for, you know, majority Kurds in the northern provinces. And so I think this is one of the key factors that's super interesting about the Tishrin protests, is this intra-elite, intra-ethnic kind of resistance that's emerging.
I think that's fascinating. And I will just take a little digression to say that I think one of the most interesting developments in the ethnic politics literature that's going on right now is the effort to show that support for in-groups, in-group representation is driven by much more than material provision of goods and services. I have a colleague in my own department, Mishal Malik, who's doing very interesting work on a group in Pakistan called the Muhajirs, showing that actually their voter base gets very little from them, but they continue, at least a component of the voter base continues to support them very strongly. And a lot of it has to do with non-material considerations related to the desire to feel represented or dignity related concerns and so forth. And then some people, of course, are turning away, as you're pointing out in the case of Iraq, where you have this intra-ethnic fragmentation and some members of particular communities are out protesting because they feel that they have not been well represented and the system is corrupt and not performing and so forth. So I think there's a lot of interesting developments in the study of ethnic politics that take us beyond the principle that it's material benefits that drive support, and also the notion that people automatically support their in-group representatives as well, which is not the case. So turning to power sharing, before we open it up, I want to ask another question about power sharing, and you posed this question in your book. So I want to ask you to elaborate on how you think about this. You ask, why do power sharing outcomes vary between highly fractionalized societies in Europe and their counterparts in the global South? I am really fascinated by this question as well, because, you know, there's a raging debate about the pros and cons of power sharing for a variety of outcomes. I'm currently working on a project with some co-authors on this myself, and we have lots of power sharing examples across the world. And some people claim that power sharing is the best system for places that have politicized ethnic or religious differences. And some people have actually claimed that it delivers. It delivers on democratic governance, on a variety of other outcomes. Whereas other folks have said, no, this is a quite dysfunctional system because it locks in governance by these groups and reduces accountability to society and a whole other other variety of mechanisms lead to dysfunctional governance through power sharing institutions. It creates cartel governance and so forth. So I'd like to hear how you think about this question about the European cases versus other cases. Why have they appeared to perform better, which we can raise some questions about, think about the case of Belgium or others, and what's going on there and the differences in the way power sharing institutions operate. And where do you fall on these debates about power sharing, about their effects on a variety of outcomes, whether it's stability or democratic governance or service delivery or whatever it might be?
Yeah, this is such an important question, and it really is. I think it's like a perennial thorn in the debate on, as you rightly noted, on how we think about consultationalism and power sharing. So in the book, and I think others have done this, but I really kind of disentangle this idea that I hone in on a question of how we understand power sharings between Western states and states in Eastern Europe, which kind of fall within the orbit of influence of stability, if we think about it that way, and Eastern Europe in proximity to states in Western Europe versus those in post-colonial states in the global South. And I do this for a couple of reasons. One, there's a really interesting and emergent kind of body of literature and ethnic politics that looks at the colonial legacies, right? How do we think about both how colonial legacies shape not only development outcomes, but shape how, different groups and divided societies come to negotiate their space, shapes kind of real deep-seated conflict. If we think about the DRC, if we think about Rwanda, Burundi, some of the kind of most violent, cases that we look to in the global South in terms of political fragmentation. And one of the things I draw on in the book is that extrapolating from Western experiences onto countries in the global South with colonially entrenched kind of both hierarchies, but also colonially institutionalized forms of kind of early state building creates generalizations that pay insufficient attention to kind of historically contingent development and how those then precondition conflict processes, group grievances, and how that then really kind of has an effect on thinking about post-conflict preferences and outcomes. And so this distinction is quite empirical, right? Like we can look at the post-colonial record of a lot of divided societies and say, in a lot of instances in the global South, power sharing hasn't fared very well. And the question then becomes, well, how do we distinguish, for example, from, broad generalizations about power sharing for countries emerging out of civil wars versus those in the global South that don't emerge out of civil wars? So I'm thinking, this is where I argue in some ways Iraq is anomalous. It's anomalous because pre-2003, the regime was pretty strong. Sure, it was under sanctions, but if we think about the actual kind of hold on power that the Ba'ath Party had before 2003, that kind of hadn't really changed. And some people argue that the sanctions made the regime become even stronger. This puts Iraq in a different category from, let's say, places like Burundi, right, or Rwanda, or the DRC, even to an extent Indonesia, where these kind of, sites of fragmentation and violence happens as a result of violent civil wars, in the case of Rwanda, genocide. And so I push back against some of these generalizations, and I kind of disentangle the relationship between how we think about institutional design in Western cases versus non-Western cases. And to argue that, although divided societies, kind of post-colonial societies, share in common attributes and conditions that heighten the potential for ethnic cleavages, the history and legacy of colonial policies that altered state development create very distinct pathways for why power sharing institutions work in certain contexts and it doesn't. And I think sometimes, as I argue in the book and push back in the book, is that colonial legacy is not really mapped out across time. We think of colonial legacies as something that happens, and then there's so much that happens afterwards that kind of alters that trajectory. That's true for some cases, but if we look again at, in the global South, especially post-colonial, divided, heterogeneous states in the global South, there's a clear kind of, underlying theme of how at least ethnic elites articulate their demands and their grievances in historical terms. And the Iraqi opposition groups do this all the time, which kind of informs their strategies and tactics both before 2003 and after 2003. So it creates a kind of, if we think about like scope conditions, I think the scope condition there will be quite different. I think this distinction serves as that scope condition for both new empirical and theoretical kind of interventions to really probe at these questions.
Great, thank you. Well, I am going to open up the discussion. We have a variety of really fantastic comments and questions in the Q&A. So I'm going to go through a number of them. And I think I'm going to start with this question about by Omar Al-Jumaila about the nature of political settlements or unsettlements, as he puts it. Do you think there is such a thing as a political settlement in Iraq right now, or is it more a kind of agreement to disagree upon the shape of the state among elites?
Yeah, this reminds me, and this is actually something that I touch on in the book. It's such a great question. Thank you, Omar. It's not a question of unsettlement. It's a question of stability. I mean, I think Ion Lustig in his famous essay in the 1970s talks about, consociationalism and the type of, do we think about stability or do we think about actual consociational arrangements that might devolve power? I think Iraq is a classic case of consociational arrangements, informal, have come to kind of shape the rules of the game because they actually provide that strategic stability for how, established ethnic political parties at this point come to maintain their power. And this is what I call ethnic state capture, right? And it's really about kind of that control and that elite bargain amongst these political parties that has generated, you can argue, it varies across time, but it's proven to be quite robust in generating stability for majority Shia groups and their kind of splintered nature, which I think is a different question, and Kurdish groups, et cetera, in terms of how they negotiate the allocation and apportionment of the state as a way of kind of both maintaining their strategic hold, but also at actually keeping and co-opting potential, real opposition groups from forming. And I think in that sense, power sharing has had the kind of perverse effect, as we've seen in other cases. Lebanon, as you know, Melani, classic case, it's provided that stability in that sense. I think much more so than Lebanon. There's various reasons for that. Oil is one. But it's kind of the political settlement. I wouldn't call it an unsettlement because it's still settled, right? These groups still operate by the informal rules of the game that they've established. And it's kind of worked in their favor in that sense.
Okay, great. And actually, I think Greg Gauze's question follows somewhat nicely from this. So he raises this question about the role of, essentially, if we have to boil it down to wonky social science terms, structure versus agency.
Yeah.
So he's asking, are the outcomes in Iraq that we've seen post-2003, can we attribute them to the choices of opposition groups after the American invasion in 2003 and the toppling of Saddam Hussein? Or are there sectarian and ethnic demographic realities that really structure what is possible and how things play out? I mean, you showed us in your presentation these figures that depict the stability of ethnic group prevalence over time, and there's very clear differences in which groups are more numerically dominant than others. So what's the relative importance of sectarian and ethnic demographic realities versus the choices that opposition groups made after 2003?
I think they're interactive. There's a synergy between the reality on the reality in Iraq is that you have a very plural society, right? And that society, that type of pluralism, I see, which is really such a thrill for me. I see Leora Lucas, who's here, who's written a fantastic book that came out in the mid-1990s, which I build on and used and learned from, that has actually looked at how that kind of plural society has generated both forms of contestation, right, and resistance, but also interethnic cooperation amongst kind of different social forces. And that predates 2003. So for example, Orig Bashkin has done fantastic work that looks at, you know, kind of the convergence of all of these different ethnic groups and kind of sectarian groups around the common kind of Iraqi nationalism in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, et cetera. I would argue that it's kind of both, right? That at the end of the day, you can't separate, you know, the violent history that Iraqi Kurds, Assyrians, Yazidis, and Turkmens in the northern provinces, which is where they tend to kind of concentrate. And in the book, I have this kind of spatial mapping of where ethnic groups are based on different census data. You can't separate the violent experience of these groups across different regimes, not just under the Ba'ath regime, including under the monarchy, from the political realities that kind of generate Kurdish, Assyrian, Yazidi, Turkmen political groups, opposition political groups. And that predates 2003. And the same with the Shias, right? So the kind of political reality on the ground in terms of how the Ba'ath regime in kind of informal and uncodified sectarian ways targeted Iraqi Shias for exclusion and repression shaped the emergence of al-Dawa and Sikri, etc. And so I see that actually as an interactive process. There's a synergy between the political parties that kind of leads to the forces that lead to their emergence that are based on kind of, you know, realities of disenfranchisement by different ethnic groups on the ground. However, the role of the opposition, I think, to Greg's question is, you know, where does the analytical weight come down for me? I think interviewing opposition members and going through some of their, you know, dissident magazines, etc. And it was quite a representative sample. So I interviewed both majority opposition group members, Kurds and Shia Arabs, but also smaller parties. And across all of them, one of the kind of things that they come to is this question of agency, that they were influencing American and British foreign policy in as much as that those governments gave them the space to do so. Mm-hmm. And for me, that was an interesting kind of empirical question that I hadn't really thought about. And I think some works on Iraq treat 2003 kind of as this, you know, critical juncture. I actually see it as a continuity, right? These same groups that kind of were quite active, that had formed ethnic opposition groups from the 1940s. Think about the KDP and some of the kind of smaller political groups like Assyrians continue on, right? And their role kind of continues to grow into a dissident and elite kind of exiled movement that then kind of comes to power in certain cases after 2003. So I see it more of a continuity in the role that these opposition groups played. And I give them a bit more weight in the book than I think I had when I started the research, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. And because my research, and I think so much of the work that we have is so heavily focused on how the Americans failed after 2003 and some of the kind of institutional and structural failures. And that's an absolutely right picture to depict, but there's something else that happens that kind of influences. There's a two-level process in that sense, is how I see it.
I see. Well, I think this is a good segue to Harry Verhoeven's question about ideology. And what is the role of political ideas in shaping what Iraq has become? Do political ideas matter? Have they animated the preferences of opposition politicians? And have these ideas shaped their visions for a post-Saddam, post-Ba'ath Party future?
Yes, and I'm going to, that's such a great question. Thank you so much. I'm going to share the screen, the slide that I started with, which is, you know, Mithaq or Charter 1991. And going through this charter, I had initially, Kenan Makia was generous enough to give me like a digital copy of it, but I collected a bunch of archives, about 40 pounds actually worth of archives from an opposition group member who was generous enough to just give me everything. And these included like seating arrangements and meetings with Al Gore and Secretary of State Madeleine Albright. And one of the interesting things was they really thought about, if we think about ideology, this question of democratization and this question of democracy, and thinking about democracy as a kind of inherent end game, to be able to convince policymakers that these groups were not only representative of what most Iraqis felt living under Ba'athist rule based on their ethnic base, but also that there was unity amongst these opposition groups, that they could, that they had a unifying ideology that was predicated on like an Iraqi sense of nationalism, even though they disagreed vehemently about the extent to which, they kind of really deep down identified with these issues. And in going through things like Charter 91, you really get a kind of a good intimate understanding of what mattered and how they saw the world. So this emphasis on like human rights principles, emphasis on how to prosecute former members of the regime, emphasis on the nature of the Democratic Party that would emerge, or democratic politics that would emerge in Iraq, should the regime be toppled, etc. So yes, the question of ideology really predominated in how these opposition groups tried to create their own sense of legitimacy, so that there would be British and American government buy-in in thinking, to Greg's question, the buy-in and kind of seeing these groups as legitimate representatives of majority of Iraqis. Now, ideology, I argue in the book, served also as an informal institution for actually institutionalizing repression and exclusion under the Ba'athist era. We see this emerging after 1968, and especially in the 1970s and 1980s, where state ideology kind of penetrates, Ba'athist ideology starts to kind of penetrate at every level of society. And this is where the argument, is the Ba'ath Party totalitarian, is it authoritarian? I would argue that at some points it does become totalitarian, because that the embeddedness of pan-Arabist ideology onto, a highly diverse society, I argue, was a way of actually managing these ethnic divisions. It was a way, the process of homogenization, which a lot of these opposition groups talk about and push back against, right? And in their kind of mobilization strategies, had a kind of, it served as this dual role. It mobilized opposition groups, but also in some ways, obviously created to like very violent outcomes, right? Targeting of Iraqi Kurds for genocide, Arabization, which is kind of a real government tactic and policy deeply rooted in pan-Arabist ideology and kind of in the process of homogenization.
Great. Now, I'd like to raise the issue of external powers. And this comes up both in one of Adil Malik's very useful comments and also in Nader Habibi's question. So Adil is pointing to the commitment problems that elite bargaining entails and the role of external actors in enabling credible commitments to stick. And then Nader is pointing out that Iraq was a target of external power interventions well before 2003, and that these interventions continue post-2003. So what is the impact of external powers, not just the US, but also of Iran, of Turkey, others, on the capacities and actual experience of Iraq's ethnic groups in cooperation and in power sharing?
Yeah, this is thank you so much for these sets of questions. It's a real exigency, right? Like there's a real threat in terms of how neighboring states have undermined the political process in Iraq. If we think about Iran's influence, but really even beyond Iran's influence, if we think about the influence of Gulf states in that early period of 2003, as in the lead up to the civil war, for example, the role of Turkey in the north and kind of Turkish incursion into Iraqi territory, that poses a kind of a real threat for how we, I think more about state fragility, and how state fragility necessarily kind of creates conditions where, pockets of rule don't exist. And here I'm thinking about the disputed territories in Iraq, where you have, for those of us who've been there, you really have very fragmented kind of security arrangements, very fragmented political arrangements. I think, though, that influence is central And I certainly don't want to undermine, for example, how regional states kind of, they're in their support for political parties and coalitions and the ways in which they operate in the country. But I do think that ultimately that these set political parties in some ways actually benefit from that, right? It makes their rule, it signals that, in some ways that their established kind of authority is the most secure form of rule. And obviously Tishreen in 2019 pushes back against this narrative, but in terms of actual tangible outcomes, it becomes much harder for reform to take place, right? When you have a protest movement that emerges that asks for reform, and the same in the Kurdistan region of Iraq, but then external powers kind of intervene through different coalitions to undermine those kind of reformist movements. But ultimately, if we think about the kind of legacy and the stickiness of power of these early institutions, I think that damage was already done in that sense. Like there's a real vested interest in the opposition groups that come to power to maintain this kind of set power sharing, informal consultational power sharing arrangement that ultimately guarantees their survival. Now, how they look towards neighboring states and the ways in which they negotiate those arrangements through a different electoral cycle certainly has an influence in the political outcomes that we see. But I wouldn't say that it drives political outcomes in that sense, if it makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Great. Well, the last couple of questions from the audience invite you to talk more about contemporary Iraqi politics. So I want to turn to the first one. Ava Shawl is asking about ethnic groups and political parties, and whether there are some that are rising in influence at the moment. And so I would broaden this question to ask you to tell us a little bit about the landscape of political actors in Iraq today, and which of those are rooted in ethnic communities. Are there some that are not rooted in ethnic communities? And which ones are gaining influence, and what does the general sort of political scene look like?
Yeah, I mean, I think Tishreen was in some ways such a critical moment because there was this, the prime minister resigns, there was this collective, thinking that independent political parties could finally kind of be able, not necessarily to, come to dominance. I don't think we're going to see that absent massive institutional change. I'll be quite honest, but and it's not because Iraqis don't want it. It's because these systems that have come to kind of see capturing of the state as a question of survival that's deeply rooted to their own survival. I think what we see is that even when you have independent MPs, for example, competing after Tishreen, really about 4 years later, those independent, coalitions or those independent candidates are stifled by the system. In other words, the system is set in a way that kind of drives independent MPs and candidates, even if they don't want to kind of ultimately, if they want a public, policy to change, to be driven by the kind of ebb and flow of sectarian apportionment or muhassasa apportionment. I'd call it ethnic apportionment because it's not just about sectarianism in Iraq. And so I think in terms of like really political parties that could, create these general coalitions, like, I'm thinking of Ayad Alawi's party competing in the first and second elections. We've actually seen over the past 20 years that those parties have kind of both not won out and have been able to, or have been kind of relegated a lot more, which to me goes back to this question of the stickiness of the system itself. And so that's not to say that the history of these kind of inter-ethnic political parties didn't exist. That was the Iraqi Communist Party, right? The history of the Iraqi Communist Party is one that starts off with a sort of resistance party against Sunni Arab dominance in that sense, if we think about the early membership and the people who brought the Iraqi Communist Party. But absent that, actually, interestingly, some opposition group members talked about that, the kind of purging of the Communist Party and its kind of diminished role in Iraqi politics. Some of them went as far as to say, we're never going to see another inter-ethnic party like the Iraqi Communist Party, which I thought was really powerful of an observation for these groups.
Okay. And Felipe Medina's question is about the Muhassasa system. And I think this follows nicely from what you were just talking about. So can you describe how it's working at the present moment?
Yeah, I think under the current government, it's interesting because the coordination framework, which is the base of support for Prime Minister al-Sudani's government right now, has kind of pushed, using different institutions of the state, has pushed back against, let's say, Kurdish interests or even kind of independent MPs' interests, in the sense of using things like the Iraqi Supreme Court to kind of, as the kind of legislative and judicial branch of government, to undermine some of the early kind of arrangements that were left to be undetermined, say the question of like resource allocation and oil revenue. They've kind of come down very, solidly on that. And I think what that has then done is that, and it's not, I shouldn't say, this isn't just the question of the coordination framework or, an outcome of Prime Minister al-Sudani's government, because we've actually seen these processes happen before 2022 and 2021. In that Muhassasa now, because it's so well entrenched, that ultimately created a system where intra-ethnic elite fragmentation and competition has become a lot more deeply seated than inter-ethnic elite competition, which I think is something that the literature really we don't have solid answers to, right? And I think this is where Iraq can be such an illustrative case in that sense, because it moves and it evolves into something that actually generates more intra-elite, ethnic elite fragmentation, at the kind of national level and at the subnational level. Think about the tension between the KDP and the PUK, the tension between the coordination framework and the Sadrists as some of the kind of dominant Shia political parties. And so I would say that Muhassasa has kind of evolved into this system that drives interest and survival, but also new forms of dissension that are much more kind of communally based than they are kind of nationally based, which I think is a fascinating evolution.
Great. Well, we're almost at time, but maybe I can take this opportunity to ask one more question. Actually, I see a new late-breaking question from Ariel Arham. To what extent does intra-group tension lead to outbidding behavior towards other groups? So we know about the dynamics of outbidding and how potentially destabilizing it is. So how is this playing out, if at all, in Iraq?
Yeah, I think one of the spaces where I've seen this play out the most, and it's an important question, is actually the splintering and the outbidding that's happening amongst, or at least that's been happening over the past few years, but really we're seeing the height of that between the two dominant Kurdish parties, the KDP and the PUK, right? Where, depending on how close one is to Baghdad versus how much one pushes against Baghdad, KDP, versus one that's kind of negotiating a different space closer to Baghdad and paramilitary groups, the PUK, I think that's where we see some of the most interesting dynamics of ethnic outbidding, right? Where these groups kind of look to Baghdad in some ways, and on the one hand as an antagonistic type of entity, right? And on the other group is kind of trying to undermine the established power of one group, the KDP in the north, to kind of argue that, actually it's more of a kind of a cooperative and mutually beneficial relationship. And so I think this intra-elite, intra-ethnic division amongst the Kurdish groups is fascinating when we look at this question of inter-ethnic outbidding. I would argue more so than Shia groups. Shia groups are divided, they're fragmented, there's ideational and material and kind of political fragmentation. But I see that as more of a natural evolution in that sense of just the kind of power dynamics between the established Shia parties. But I should say too, between the KDP and the PUK, I mean, 1996, there was a whole civil war between 1994 and 1996 that was fought between these two parties. But these divisions, I think, are becoming a lot more salient, and Baghdad is certainly kind of seeing this fissure as an opportunity.
Great. And I have one last question myself, since we have a couple minutes left, which is it possible once you have a power sharing system, even one that is informally based, not enshrined and codified in formal parchment paper, is it possible to have institutional change, meaningful institutional change, to move away from power sharing institutions once they've been established? Or is there a kind of lock-in effect so it becomes basically impossible to unwind from that?
Yeah, I think this is such a great question, and it's something I contend with, and kind of thinking of more broadly about the literature and where it's gone and some of the questions that have come up. I think I think oftentimes when we think about like political development, political settlements, they really come at a rupture, right? There's some sort of either domestic shock or exogenous shock that gets elites to rethink, renegotiate, whether or not certain institutional arrangements work. In the case of Iraq, that's an exogenous shock, that you have a foreign intervention that then catapults certain groups to power, and those groups then maintain their kind of survival and hold on power. If we think about, power sharing, a baseline definition of power sharing as these institutional arrangements, these prescriptions that ultimately mitigate conflict and allow the distribution of key governing institutions of the state amongst ethnic stakeholders, I think in that sense, to me, it makes institutional change absent some sort of a deep exogenous or endogenous shock with domestically. I think it becomes much harder to change. In other words, I think what I'm saying is that unless we see, another foreign intervention, which we're probably not going to see, or if we see, an outbreak of civil war, right, somewhere in the country where you have both, groups kind of really fragmenting authority, I don't see how these power sharing institutions can work, because they're working to maintain the hold on power that political parties have, which is something they sought. And so changing the system, changing the institutions of the system, I think will be much more difficult once the inertia of that stability has been set, which is something I argue in the book. That's not to say that change is impossible. I think, we're seeing kind of maybe, especially under Soudani, one of the things I'm paying attention to is this kind of the question of like, how do you tackle corruption? It's interesting that there's kind of attention that's being paid to that, but it ultimately, I think in terms of real change, I think that's going to be hard to see.
Great. Thank you so much.
Okay, well, I think we have run out of time, but I want to thank both Professor Mako and Professor Cammett for such a thought-provoking conversation. And I'd also want to give special thanks to Karen Spira, who is the Assistant Director at the Crown Center, who has made all of this possible and seamless. So thank you so much. And to the audience, if we didn't get to your questions or there are other things you want to raise, please know that we send a complete list of questions to our participants for them to consider. And you can, of course, contact them directly via email. I should say that also we are going to have our next session at the Crown Center is scheduled for Wednesday, February 7th. We're going to have Jessica Barnes, who comes from the University of South Carolina, and she's going to be speaking about her work on food security or insecurity in Egypt, and drawing on her newest book on staple security, bread and wheat in Egypt. So we look forward to engaging with you then. And from everyone here at the Crown Center, thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see you in a couple of weeks. Thank you.